I didn't raise my voice. I sat perfectly still as the clinking of silverware stopped and the air in the restaurant turned to ice. "You thought you were defending me, Mom?" I asked, my voice as flat as a dial tone. My mother didn't even flinch. She leaned over her salad and gestured toward my in-laws with a self-righteous smirk. "They were judging you for being a divorcee. I just told them the truth about the miscarriage and the counseling so they'd shut up." My husband's face was drained of all color, his fork hovering mid-air as he looked at me like I was a stranger. "You didn't defend me," I whispered, opening my laptop on the table. "You just handed them the bullets to finish me off." My mother thinks she saved my marriage by airing my darkest secrets at a crowded restaurant. She told my new in-laws every detail I had spent 5 years trying to bury. The miscarriage, the failed therapy, the nights I spent crying on the kitchen floor. She calls it defending my honor. My husband calls it a total breach of trust. But what my mother doesn't know is that while she was busy weaponizing my past, I was busy auditing her present. If your own mother turned your life into a public spectacle to help you, would you forgive her? Or would you ensure she never had the chance to speak your name again? If you were in my position, what would you do? Type 1A if you would try to forgive her because she had good intentions, or type 2B if you would cut her off entirely for violating your privacy. Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that button now, because what I discovered in her financial records during the fallout is about to change everything. I have always preferred numbers to narratives. Numbers are clean. They don't have good intentions, they don't suffer from selective memory, and they don't change their value depending on who is sitting across the table from them. At 36, after a first marriage that felt like a slow-motion car crash, I had finally achieved a life that was mathematically sound. I had a stable career, a home with a mortgage I could manage solo, and Mark, a man whose kindness was the first constant variable I had ever been able to truly rely on. We had been married for exactly 14 months. To Mark, our marriage was a beautiful new beginning. To me, it was a carefully reconstructed fortress. I had spent 5 years rebuilding my psyche after my first divorce. That period of my life wasn't a scandal. It was a long, private collapse. It was a miscarriage that left me hollow, months of marriage counseling that felt like talking to a brick wall, and a growing, heavy resentment that only lifted when I heard the front door close behind my ex-husband. When I finally left, it wasn't because of a dramatic reveal. It was because the relief of being alone was more addictive than the hope of being loved. Mark's parents, the Harrisons, were a different kind of challenge. They were old school in a way that felt like stepping back into a period piece where appearances were more important than oxygen. They were polite, certainly. They never raised their voices, and they never missed a thank you note. But they had a specific way of looking at me, a look that said they were constantly measuring the baggage I brought into their son's life. "It's just so lovely that Mark found someone who understands the value of a second chance," his mother would say, her voice as smooth as polished silver, while we sipped tea in her impeccably curated living room. She would tilt her head slightly, her eyes scanning me for signs of wear and tear. "We always tell him, lessons learned the hard way are often the ones that stick the most, don't they?" I never gave her the reaction she wanted. I didn't flinch, I didn't blush, and I didn't defend myself. I would simply set my teacup down, ensuring the porcelain made no sound against the saucer, and offer a thin, practiced smile. I am too old to keep auditioning for approval. My past was a closed ledger, and the internal balance had already been settled. My own mother, however, did not share my appreciation for silence. She saw the Harrisons' passive-aggressive comments not as noise to be ignored, but as a battlefield. She had watched me crumble 5 years ago. She had seen the hospital bills from the miscarriage and the invoices from the therapist. To her, my silence wasn't strength. It was a missed opportunity to win. I didn't know it then, but as we prepared for my niece's piano recital, the variables were already shifting. I was worried about the traffic on the I-95. I was checking my watch, calculating that I would be exactly 22 minutes late to the lunch following the performance. I thought the only thing I had to lose that day was a bit of time. I didn't realize that while I was stuck in a gridlock, my mother was preparing to set fire to the only thing I valued more than my marriage, my privacy. The Harrison residence was always kept at exactly 68 degrees. It was a temperature that demanded a certain level of stiffness, a crispness that matched the starch in their linen napkins and the rigid posture of Mark's mother, Evelyn. To the casual observer, our Sunday dinners were the pinnacle of domestic harmony. To me, they were a weekly forensic audit of my character. Evelyn Harrison had a way of speaking that made every compliment feel like a disguised indictment. She didn't use slurs or direct insults. She used the weapon of concern. We were sitting in their dining room, the light from the chandelier reflecting off the polished mahogany table with a surgical brightness. The only sound was the rhythmic, muted click of sterling silver against bone china, Wedgwood, Windsor gray pattern. "You know, Mark," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into that honeyed, dangerous register she reserved for teaching moments. She wasn't looking at her son, she was looking directly at me. "I was reading an article in the Journal of Sociology about the complexity of blended families. It mentioned that the success rate of second marriages is significantly lower when one party carries, let's call it, unresolved structural damage from their past." Mark reached over and squeezed my hand. He meant it as a gesture of solidarity, but all it did was signal to his mother that her arrow had found its mark. "Mom, we've talked about this. My wife doesn't have structural damage. She has experience. There's a difference." "Of course, dear," Evelyn replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. She turned back to me, her head tilted at a precise 15-degree angle. "I just worry, as any mother would. When a foundation has been shaken once, it's only natural to check for cracks every time the wind blows. It's a matter of safety, wouldn't you agree?" I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my wine glass to steady my nerves. My pulse remained a rhythmic, clinical 65 beats per minute. I had spent years in therapy learning how to become a ghost to other people's expectations. If I didn't provide the crack she was looking for, she had nothing to exploit. "I agree that safety is paramount, Evelyn," I said, my voice as flat and clear as a mountain lake, "which is why I find that transparency and boundaries are far more effective than speculation. Would you like me to pass the salt?" The table went silent. Not a shocked silence, but a heavy, pressurized one. Evelyn's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She hated my composure. She wanted me to be the messy divorcee, the woman who had failed at her first attempt at life and was now desperately trying to cling to her son's stability. My refusal to be ashamed was, to her, the ultimate act of defiance. In the seat next to me, my own mother, Diane, was vibrating with a different kind of energy. If Evelyn was a surgical blade, my mother was a blunt instrument wrapped in velvet. I could feel the heat radiating from her. She had been invited to this dinner as a gesture of family unity, but Diane didn't do unity, she did protection. She had watched me during the years of my first marriage, the nights I had called her, unable to speak through the tears because the miscarriage had left me too hollow to find words. She knew the cost of every brick in the fortress I had built. "Safety is a funny word to use, Evelyn," Diane said, her voice tight. She wasn't eating. She was gripped the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were the color of the china. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a house isn't a crack in the foundation. It's the people who keep trying to dig holes under it just to see if it'll fall. "Diane, please," I said, my tone a quiet warning. I didn't need a defender. In the mathematics of my life, my mother was a variable I couldn't always control, and that made her a liability in a room full of Harrisons. Evelyn just laughed, a soft, tittering sound that didn't contain a shred of mirth. "Oh, we're all friends here. We just want what's best for the couple. We just want to make sure there are no more surprises. Total honesty is the only way to build a future, don't you think?" That was the theme of the next 3 months. Total honesty. But what Evelyn meant was total submission. Every dinner, every phone call, every polite inquiry was a probe into the parts of my life I had chosen to keep private. They wanted to know why the first marriage ended. They wanted to know if I was capable of being a good wife this time. They treated my past like a crime scene they had a right to investigate. And through it all, I remained clinical. I remained steady. I thought that as long as I kept the gates of my fortress locked, no one could get in. I didn't realize that my mother was standing right next to the lever that controlled the drawbridge, and she was getting tired of the siege. The day of the recital was supposed to be the end of it. We were supposed to go to lunch, celebrate my niece, and then Mark and I would go home to the quiet, peaceful life we had fought so hard to build. But as I sat in that traffic jam on the I-95, watching the digital clock on my dashboard tick from 12:15 to 12:38, I didn't know that the conversation at the restaurant had already turned toward the unresolved structural damage of my past. And this time, my mother wasn't going to use metaphors. The auditorium had been filled with the scent of floor wax and expensive perfume. It was the kind of environment where every cough sounded like a gunshot and every whispered comment felt like a breach of protocol. I sat through the performances with my hands folded in my lap, my breathing rhythmic and shallow. I focused on the technicality of the music rather than the emotion of it. Music, after all, is just math that you can hear. When the event ended, the transition to the restaurant was supposed to be seamless. We had a reservation for 12:30 p.m. at the Glass House, an upscale bistro known for its floor-to-ceiling windows and its unforgiving acoustics. In a room like that, there is nowhere for a conversation to hide. I watched Mark lead his parents toward their silver sedan. Evelyn looked like a portrait of suburban royalty in her cream-colored wool coat, her movements precise and curated. My mother followed behind them, her stride shorter, faster, her shoulders pulled back in a way that suggested she was bracing for impact. I should have seen the warning signs then, the way she didn't look at me when she said she'd meet us there, the way her grip tightened on her leather handbag. "I'll be right behind you," I told Mark, kissing his cheek. "I just need to stop by the office to drop off those folders for Monday's audit. It'll take 10 minutes, tops." That was my first miscalculation. By 12:18 p.m., I was merging onto the interstate. By 12:22 p.m., the brake lights in front of me blossomed into a sea of static red. A construction crew had closed 2 lanes for emergency pipe repairs. My GPS recalculated instantly, the estimated arrival time jumping from 12:31 to 12:49, then 12:55. I sat in the cockpit of my car, the air conditioning humming a steady E-flat. I didn't honk. I didn't drum my fingers on the steering wheel. I simply watched the digital clock. Time is a fixed resource. Getting angry at a traffic jam is as logical as getting angry at the rain. But as the minutes ticked by, a cold, familiar sensation began to settle in the pit of my stomach. I was the buffer. In the delicate chemistry of our family dynamic, I was the neutralizing agent. Without me, my mother and Evelyn Harrison were 2 highly reactive elements placed in a pressurized container. At 12:40 p.m., my phone buzzed in the center console, a text from Mark. "We're seated. My parents are asking about the logistics of our holiday plans again. Your mom looks like she's about to snap her breadstick in half. Hurry." I didn't reply. I couldn't. I was staring at a stalled semi-truck 3 cars ahead of me. I checked my internal monitors. Heart rate, 72 BPM. Stress level, elevated but manageable. I began to run simulations of the conversation happening 3 miles away. Evelyn would be making a comment about legacy or clean slates. She would be using her softest, most condescending voice to remind everyone that I was a woman with a history. A woman who had failed once and was therefore a permanent risk. My mother, Diane, would be sitting across from her, her face flushing that specific shade of crimson that preceded a verbal explosion. Diane had never understood my clinical approach. She saw my silence as weakness, my boundaries as a lack of courage. She wanted to scream the truth at the world because she thought the truth was a shield. She didn't realize that in the hands of people like the Harrisons, the truth is just raw material for a better insult. 12:52 p.m. The traffic began to crawl, 4 miles per hour, 5. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a notification from our shared bank account, a small, seemingly insignificant charge from the restaurant's bar. A double scotch. My mother only ordered double scotches when she was preparing for a confrontation. The heat in the car felt suddenly oppressive, despite the climate control. I realized then that I wasn't just late for a lunch. I was late for the end of my reputation. I knew Evelyn's tactics. She would poke and prod until she found the most sensitive nerve, and then she would press down with the weight of her polite concern. And I knew my mother's fatal flaw. She believed that the only way to stop a bully was to become the monster the bully was afraid of. As I finally took the exit for the restaurant at 1:04 p.m., the silence in my car felt deafening. I parked the car with clinical precision, ensuring the tires were perfectly parallel to the white lines. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was smooth. My expression was a blank slate. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the glass doors of the bistro. I could see them through the window. The table was tucked into a corner, surrounded by white linen and the soft, expensive hum of a Saturday afternoon. But as I got closer, I noticed that the hum had stopped. The tables nearby were turned toward the corner. The waiters were standing still, their trays held tight against their chests. The air inside the restaurant hit me like a physical wall. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a gunshot. I saw Evelyn Harrison sitting bolt upright, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and predatory glee. I saw Mark, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. And then I saw my mother. She was leaning forward, her glass of scotch empty, a triumphant, jagged smile on her face. She looked at me as I approached, her eyes bright with the fever of a victory that was about to cost me everything. "There she is," my mother announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I was just telling them, honey. I was just setting the record straight so they'd finally show you some respect." I stopped exactly 3 feet from the table. I didn't look at the in-laws. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the empty glass in front of my mother, and I felt the math of my life finally break. The silence in the restaurant was not a void. It was a weight. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the sharp metallic scent of expensive cutlery and the faint citrusy trail of my mother's perfume. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. I didn't sit down. I needed to remain mobile, even if only in spirit. "What exactly?" I began, my voice a low, steady frequency that seemed to vibrate the water glasses. "Did you feel needed to be set straight, Mother?" Evelyn Harrison was the first to move. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water, her eyes never leaving mine. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, not sympathy, but a satisfied curiosity. She had finally found the structural damage she had been looking for, and it was far more extensive than she had ever dared to hope. "Your mother was just sharing the challenges you faced in your previous life," Evelyn said. Her voice was a masterpiece of manufactured empathy. "We had no idea, dear. Truly. We were just discussing how fortunate it is that you and Mark could start this new chapter on a cleaner foundation, and Diane felt we should understand just how dirty the old one was." I looked at my mother. She was beaming. She looked like a soldier who had just successfully defended a hill, unaware that she had burned the city she was supposed to protect in the process. "They were talking about you like you were some kind of damaged goods, honey," my mother said, her voice rising with a frantic, self-righteous energy. She gestured toward Evelyn with a butter knife. "I wasn't going to sit here and let them act like your divorce was just some whim. I told them. I told them about the 18 months of counseling that led to nowhere because he wouldn't listen. I told them about the miscarriage at 11 weeks and how you had to drive yourself to the hospital because he was too busy at work to answer his phone." The words hit the table like lead weights. Mark flinched as if he had been struck. He looked at me, and for the first time in our 14 months of marriage, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of the version of me he didn't know, the version that had been laid bare in front of his parents by the woman who gave me life. "You told them that?" I asked. My heart rate hadn't climbed above 80, but my fingers were beginning to feel cold. I focused on the sensation, the literal withdrawal of blood from my extremities as my body prepared for a crisis. I had to, she insisted, her eyes wide. Evelyn said that baggage is a sign of poor character. I told her your baggage was a tragedy, not a fault. I told her how you cried for 3 months straight after the procedure. I told her that you were a saint for staying as long as you did. I looked around the restaurant. A couple 2 tables over had stopped mid-bite, their forks hovering over their plates. A waiter stood frozen near the kitchen door, his eyes fixed on our corner. My private life, the most carefully guarded data set in my existence, had been transformed into public entertainment. "Mark," I said, turning my gaze to my husband. "Did you know about the hospital trip? The details?" Mark's voice was a ragged whisper. "No, you told me you lost the baby, but you never said you were alone. You never told me he didn't show up. Why is your mother telling my parents things I don't even know?" "Because she's a weapon, Mark," I replied, my voice as clinical as a surgeon's. "And weapons don't care who they hit as long as they make an impact." I finally sat down. I pulled my chair in with a soft, muffled scrape against the carpet. I reached for the menu, though I had no intention of eating. My mother reached across the table to touch my arm, but I moved it just an inch, enough to make her hand land on the white linen instead. "Don't be like that," she hissed, her triumph beginning to sour into defensiveness. "I was on your side. They were judging you. I shut them up, didn't I? Look at them. They aren't saying a word now." It was true. Evelyn and her husband were deathly quiet. But it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a predator who had just been given a detailed map of their prey's weaknesses. Every detail my mother had weaponized, the miscarriage, the failed therapy, the isolation, was now a permanent part of the Harrison family's file on me. It was no longer a private history, it was a public record. "You didn't shut them up, Mother," I said, looking at the empty glass of scotch in front of her. "You just gave them a reason to never trust me. And more importantly, you gave me a reason to never trust you." The restaurant's refrigerator hummed in the background, a low, persistent drone that suddenly felt like the only honest sound in the room. I picked up my phone and opened my banking app. If the chemistry of the room had turned toxic, I needed to look at the math. And the math told me that my mother's protection always came with a hidden cost. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, a thick pressure that made the hum of the industrial refrigerators sound like a roar. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the white linen tablecloth. My heart rate remained a steady 64 beats per minute. Across from me, my mother looked triumphant, her cheeks flushed with the heat of her victory. To her right, my in-laws, Evelyn and her husband, were frozen, their eyes wide as they processed the intimate data points of my trauma, the 18 months of failed counseling and the 11-week miscarriage. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I reached into my handbag and pulled out my digital tablet. I opened a blank document. "Let's be precise, Mother," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "You mentioned the miscarriage. Did you also provide the exact hospital records or just the emotional summary?" My mother's smile faltered. "What? No. I was defending you. I wanted them to see how much you've endured so they'd stop judging your divorce." I turned to Mark. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His face was the color of damp ash. He wasn't looking at his parents. He was looking at me like I was a stranger whose secrets had just been auctioned off to the highest bidder. "Mark," I whispered, "I'm sorry you had to hear about the hospital alone time this way." Mark didn't answer. He stood up slowly, his chair making a single sharp clack against the hardwood floor. He didn't look back as he walked toward the glass doors, leaving the ruins of the lunch behind him. "Look what you've done," my mother hissed, leaning across the table, her breath smelling of the double scotch she had ordered. "Your coldness is driving him away. I was the only one in this room standing up for you." "You weren't standing up for me," I replied, standing up and smoothing my blazer with clinical precision. "You were using my past as ammunition. And in this house, I am the only one who controls the armory." I walked out of the restaurant without looking at my in-laws. I didn't head for my car to chase Mark. I knew he needed time to process the breach. Instead, I sat in my driver's seat and opened the encrypted folder containing my mother's financial records, the ones I had helped her organize 6 months ago. If she wanted to turn my life into a public audit, I was going to ensure her own books were perfectly balanced, and I knew exactly where the discrepancies were hidden. The interior of my car felt like a vacuum. Outside, the world continued its chaotic orbit, waiters clearing tables, cars exiting the parking lot, but inside, there was only the steady blue glow of my laptop screen. I didn't call Mark. I didn't send a frantic text to my mother. I didn't even turn on the engine. I simply logged into the encrypted drive where I kept my mother's digital records. 6 months ago, she had asked me to help organize her estate. She claimed she was getting older and wanted everything to be neat for me. At the time, I saw it as a rare moment of maternal consideration. Now, through the lens of her betrayal at lunch, I saw it as a strategic move. She had given me the keys to her life so she could walk through the front door of mine and burn it down. My fingers moved across the trackpad with surgical precision. I wasn't looking for letters or photos. I was looking for the numbers. Why was she so desperate to shut up the Harrisons? Why did she need them to see me as a victim rather than an equal? Then, I saw it. A recurring payment of $428.50 to a high-interest credit servicer. The account was in her name, but the secondary contact listed was my maiden name. I dug deeper. 3 months ago, a personal loan for $15,000 had been approved. The digital signature was a clumsy approximation of my own handwriting from a decade ago. She hadn't defended me at lunch out of love. She had done it to create a smokescreen. By making me the center of a tragic public drama, she ensured that no one, not me, and certainly not the judgmental Harrisons, would look too closely at her own crumbling foundation. She wanted me fragile so I would stay close. She wanted me distracted so I wouldn't notice she was subsidizing her lifestyle with my credit score. I closed the laptop. My heart rate was exactly 64 beats per minute. The rage I felt wasn't a fire, it was a block of ice, heavy and clear. If you were in my position, what would you do? Type 1A if you would try to forgive her because she had good intentions, or type 2B if you would cut her off entirely for violating your privacy and stealing your identity. Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that button now, because what I discovered in her financial records during the fallout is about to change everything. I put the car in gear. I wasn't going home to cry. I was going to the one place where numbers were the only language spoken, my lawyer's office. My mother wanted a drama. I was going to give her a deposition. I arrived at the law offices of Arthur Sterling at exactly 3:15 p.m. The environment was a perfect vacuum of beige walls and filtered air. There was no drama here, only the low hum of a high-speed printer and the rhythmic tapping of a paralegal's keyboard. It was exactly what I needed. I handed Arthur the digital trail I had compiled, the $15,000 loan application, the IP address trace that led directly to my mother's home router, and the $428.50 monthly payments she had been siphoning from a dormant account I hadn't checked in months. The signature is a crude approximation, Arthur noted, adjusting his glasses. In a forensic audit, this wouldn't hold up for 10 seconds. Do you want to file a police report? Not yet, I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat monitor. I want a meeting. I sent my mother a single text. Meet me at Sterling & Associates. We need to finalize the protection you mentioned at lunch. She arrived 20 minutes later, still draped in her self-righteousness. She walked into the conference room with a practiced sigh, ready to deliver another lecture on my coldness. I'm glad you're finally coming to your senses, she began, sitting across from me. That lunch was a disaster, but at least the truth is out. We can move past this now. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I simply slid a blue manila folder across the mahogany table. It contained the loan document with her forged signature circled in red ink. I didn't bring you here to talk about the lunch, Mother, I said, my eyes locked on hers. I brought you here to talk about account number 4021 and the $15,000 you took out in my name while I was distracted by my divorce. The color drained from her face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at the security camera in the upper corner of the room. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to crush the breath out of a weaker person. I was going to pay it back, she whispered, her voice finally cracking. I did it for us, to keep the house so you'd have somewhere to go if things failed again. You didn't do it for me, I replied, leaning forward just an inch. You did it because you knew I was too broken to notice. You weaponized my trauma at lunch to make sure I stayed broken and dependent. But the math has changed, Mom, and you're no longer a part of the equation. I stood up, the chair making a single sharp thud against the carpet. I didn't wait for her to cry. I didn't wait for the excuses. I left her in the room with Arthur and the evidence. Outside, the sun was bright and the air was clear. For the first time in 5 years, the ledger was balanced. The silence of my home was the most expensive thing I owned. It didn't have a price tag, but the cost of maintaining it was becoming astronomical. When I walked through the front door at 5:45 p.m., the house was exactly 72 degrees. The air was filtered and sterile, carrying the faint, clean scent of eucalyptus. Mark was sitting at the kitchen island. He didn't turn around when the deadbolt clicked. He was staring at a glass of water, the ice long since melted, leaving a ring of condensation on the dark quartz. He looked like a man who had just seen the blueprints for a building he had lived in for years, only to realize there were sub-basements he never knew existed. I spoke to Arthur, I said, my voice steady, barely a ripple in the quiet air. I placed the blue folder on the counter between us. The $15,000 is being handled. She's agreed to sign a confession of judgment in exchange for me not filing the formal police report. It's a civil resolution. Clean. Quiet. Mark finally looked up. His eyes weren't angry, they were exhausted. Is that how you see everything? Civil resolutions? Clean math? Your mother turned our family lunch into a public autopsy of your womb and your mental health, and you went to an office to talk about bank transfers. I went to the office to remove the leverage she had over me, Mark, I replied. I didn't sit down. I stood with my feet shoulder-width apart, my posture perfect. She weaponized my past because she was using it as a shield to hide her theft. If I don't settle the debt, she remains a variable I cannot control, and I will not live in an equation I can't solve. The phone on the counter began to vibrate. The screen lit up. Mom. It hummed against the stone surface, a frantic, buzzing sound that felt like an insect trapped in a jar. We both watched it. I didn't reach for it. My heart rate stayed at a rhythmic 68 beats per minute. She called Evelyn, Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Before she went to your lawyer's office, she told my mother that you were unstable and that the lunch was her trying to stage an intervention. She's already spinning a new narrative to save herself. Let her, I said. I picked up my phone, but not to answer. I opened my contacts and performed a clinical deletion. One name, one history, one liability. Evelyn Harrison values appearances above all else. When she receives the copy of the confession of judgment I'm sending her tomorrow morning, the one where my mother admits to identity fraud, Evelyn won't care about interventions. She'll care about the fact that her new best friend is a documented felon. Mark looked at me, and for the first time I saw the shift. He wasn't looking at the victim my mother had described at lunch. He was looking at the woman who had survived it. You're not going to cry, are you? He asked. Crying is a physiological response to a lack of options, I said, sliding the folder toward him so he could see the cold, hard facts. And as of 3 o'clock today, I have more options than she ever will. The house went quiet again. The phone stopped vibrating. In the distance, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the only honest sound left in the world. I wasn't just defending my marriage, I was auditing my soul. And for the first time in 5 years, the balance was starting to look like a profit. I didn't invite them to a home. I invited them back to the glass house. It was a tactical choice. People like Evelyn Harrison and my mother are governed by the fear of a public scene. In a room full of witnesses, they are forced to be their most civilized selves, which is exactly when they are most vulnerable to the truth. I arrived first. I ordered a black coffee, no sugar. I sat with my back to the window, the afternoon sun casting a sharp, uncompromising light across the table. I placed 2 folders on the white linen, one blue, one red. When they arrived, Evelyn looking smug, my mother looking weary but still clutching her mask of martyrdom, the silence at the table was immediate. Mark sat beside me, his presence a silent, solid weight. "I assume we're here to discuss your recovery, dear?" Evelyn asked, her voice dripping with that familiar, synthetic concern. "Your mother told us you've been under a lot of stress lately. Financial stress, perhaps?" I didn't answer her directly. I pushed the red folder toward her and the blue folder toward my mother. "In the blue folder, Mother, is the no contact agreement," I said, my voice a steady, clinical drone. "It stipulates that any attempt to contact me, Mark, or any member of our extended family will result in the immediate filing of the identity theft charges currently sitting on my lawyer's desk. The $15,000 will be repaid in monthly installments, or the civil suit becomes a criminal one." My mother's hands shook as she opened the folder. "You're disowning your own mother? Over a misunderstanding?" "It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a line item," I replied. I turned to Evelyn. "And in your folder, Evelyn, you'll find the evidence of the woman you've been using as a source. My mother didn't reveal my trauma to protect me. She did it to distract from the fact that she was stealing from me. If you continue to use my private medical history as social currency, I will ensure that every one of your old-school associates receives a copy of this confession. I imagine identity fraud is a rather messy foundation for a friendship, wouldn't you say?" Evelyn's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. She looked at my mother with a mixture of disgust and primal fear. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it collapsed. I had no idea," Evelyn stammered, closing the folder as if it were radioactive. "Now you do," I said, standing up. I didn't wait for them to sign. I didn't need to. The leverage was absolute. "The audit is closed. My past is no longer up for debate, and my mother is no longer a variable in this family. Check the math, Evelyn. It's finally perfect." I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Behind me, the only sound was the clink of a spoon hitting the floor, a small, lonely sound in a room full of ruined reputations. The drive home from the restaurant was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a predatory thing waiting to swallow me whole. It felt like a clean slate. Mark drove with his hands at 10 and 2, his eyes fixed on the road, his profile steady against the fading afternoon light. We didn't talk about my mother. We didn't talk about Evelyn. We had reached a point where the data had been processed, the audit was complete, and the final report had been issued. There was nothing left to speculate on. When we stepped inside our house, the atmosphere was exactly as I liked it, controlled, cool, and silent. I went straight to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of room-temperature water. I watched the surface of the liquid settle into a perfect, glassy plane. My heart rate was 62 beats per minute. "She called again while we were walking to the front door," Mark said, leaning against the counter. He didn't look at his phone. He looked at me. "She left a voicemail. She was crying. She said she did it all because she was afraid of losing you. She said the money was for a safety net in case my parents drove us apart." I took a slow, methodical sip of my water. I could feel the coolness sliding down my throat, a physical reminder of my own reality. Fear is not a justification for fraud, Mark, and protection is not a license to weaponize trauma. She didn't want a safety net for me. She wanted a leash. She wanted to ensure that no matter how much I rebuilt my life, there would always be a part of it that belonged to her. A secret, a debt, a scar. I set the glass down on the quartz. As of today, the leash is cut. The debt is being repaid at $428.50 a month. She is no longer a mother. She is a transaction. And as for your parents, I suspect the silence from their end will be permanent. Mark nodded slowly. He reached across the counter and covered my hand with his. His skin was warm, a contrast to the cold calculation of the day's events. "My mother called me while you were in with the lawyer. She was terrified. She asked me if I really thought you would follow through with the evidence. I told her that you don't make threats. You make assessments. And right now, her assessment is that she needs to stay very, very quiet. I offered him the thinnest of smiles. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of satisfaction. The architecture of my life was finally structurally sound. The cracks Evelyn had looked for were sealed with the very truth she had tried to use against me. People often ask me if it was hard to walk away. They ask if I feel a void where a mother should be. But in the mathematics of peace, you don't mourn the removal of a negative number. You simply appreciate the fact that the total is finally positive. My miscarriage, my first marriage, my private pain, they are no longer weapons in someone else's arsenal. They are simply chapters in a book that I have finally finished writing. Boundaries aren't walls built out of hate. They are fences built out of self-respect. If someone burns your house down to keep you warm, they don't deserve a seat at your new table. They deserve to be watched from a distance as they sift through the ashes they created.